Okay, welcome back to a very special episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from this very ultra hot day in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles. With me, we have Colonel Kevin Randle, the one and only ufologist, a colonel in the Air Force, right?
Nope. I retired from the Army.
Army. Okay, Army. And
I spent time in the Air Force, but I retired from the Army.
So you were both, actually.
Yes.
You know what? I really got to hand it to you. And you also have a PhD.
Yes.
So you have two ranks from two military branches and very accomplished. And I was just telling Colonel Randle just before we started that literally when I was planning to do a Roswell show, I couldn't think of anyone better than to get, of course, the Colonel Kevin Randle. So, Colonel, for those people, it's kind of hard to say that people don't know what really happened at Roswell 74 years later, especially this day and age. But because of the UAP report that came out on the 25th, because of the massive influx of people finally paying attention to this topic, for the first time, as you've noticed, we're not being ridiculed like we were, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or especially 20 years ago. What happened for those people who are living under a rock that think Roswell and they don't know anything else about it?
Well, let's say first off that the UAP report had nothing to do with Roswell. They didn't even bother to look at that information. It was all geared to the 144 reports that were made by the Navy and the Air Force. They just looked at that. I thought the thing they should have been doing was, of course, looking at the history of ufology as well to get some kind of a perspective of what was going on. So having said all of that, we get to the Roswell case, which basically was a crash of an alien spacecraft. It was recovered by the United States. Well, it was Army Air Forces at the time, later the Air Force.
Yeah, RAAF, right? Roswell Army Airfield.
Yes. And it's at the time there was no Air Force as a separate body. It was part of the Army. So the Army was split into two groups: Army Ground Forces and Army Air Forces, all under the command of General Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. So the people at Roswell recovered the debris found by Mac Brazel, who was a rancher in the area, took part of it to Fort Worth, where General Ramey looked at it and began the first cover-up, which was, well, it's just a weather balloon, and these guys overreacted to it. The Air Force then in 1995, after we'd gotten a lot of publicity with the UFO crash at Roswell, a lot of discussion of Roswell materials, did their own investigation, but what it really did was look for documentation. They didn't really do any investigation, a lot of investigation into what happened. They looked for documentation and said that it was a top secret Project Mogul. Yeah. Mogul itself, the purpose was top secret. What was going on in New Mexico was not. They were using off-the-shelf weather balloons and Ray-Wind radar targets, which the people at Roswell would have easily recognized for what they were. But they put out this idea that it was this top secret Project Mogul, and everybody appended what was going on in New Mexico as top secret as well. And of course it was not. That was unclassified. In fact, pictures of Mogul arrays appeared in the newspapers on July 10th, like 2 days after the Roswell information was released. Mogul simply does not explain anything. In fact, there is no current terrestrial explanation for what fell at Roswell. Everybody agrees something fell at Roswell. It's just what it was. And I think the skeptics who are truly skeptical look at the explanation, are concerned about it, but they're in the position where they have to accept it as the explanation, because if they don't, there's nothing else they can talk about. And those of us, some of us on the other side, like me, say, well, you know, we don't have the craft, we don't have the bodies, we do not have the evidence we need to absolutely prove it, but there's nowhere else to go with it. And so for some people that's sufficient. For me, I'd like a little bit more, but I lean toward the extraterrestrial.
I agree. And you know what? When they released that, when Ramey basically broke down the story and said that it was not a flying saucer and it was in fact a weather balloon, you know, I thought to myself, how can they screw that up? Who in their right mind would say this is a flying saucer and then the next day say, oops, sorry, we confused it for a weather balloon? And Jesse Marcel, being an intelligence officer at the base, he's not going to be one who would misidentify something at the only nuclear armament in the entire planet at the time.
Well, I see as one of the comments, they say, why would they be doing a weather balloon experiment in New Mexico? And they weren't doing weather balloon experiments. What they were doing was testing an idea that there was an acoustical level in the atmosphere similar to the acoustical level in the ocean. If you get down to about 200 feet, sound travels an amazing distance in the ocean. And they postulated that there was such an acoustical level in the atmosphere, and they were trying to create a balloon that would stay at that level for a period of time, hoping to pick up the detonations of Soviet testing of atomic bombs. So that was what they were doing, but they were using off-the-shelf weather equipment to do it, to create these clusters of balloons with these long arrays and these radar targets. But that wasn't really classified. Nobody cared what they were doing. They were launching them in the daytime. They were taking pictures of them and publishing in the newspapers. But the purpose, to spy on the Soviets, that was the real top secret involved there. So it wasn't a weather balloon experiment in New Mexico. It was an attempt to create a device to spy on the Soviets. And of course, the U-2s and other spy planes kind of wrecked that idea, because an airplane is much better than a balloon that you have no control over once you launch it. You're stuck with the winds aloft and where they're blowing, as opposed to where you'd like it to go.
And you got 70,000 feet, I believe, above sea levels where you could travel at the U-2?
At least 70,000. I know the SR-71 would travel at 100,000 feet, which is basically the edge of space.
Stratosphere, yeah.
And I think, I'm not sure if the U-2 got up that high. What's interesting about the SR-71, I point out, which has no relevance to the discussion at all, but if a Soviet fighter got into a tail chase with an SR-71 and fired a missile at it, SR-71 was fast enough to outrun the missile. Which is really fast.
Yeah. You know, that is my favorite plane of all time. I know why they retired it, essentially because of the noise. You can't cross it over the United States, for example, without a sonic boom that would scare the living Jesus of everybody in the United States. And there's some. But let me ask you about the Roswell Craft. I actually pulled this out for today, if you could see it. Now, of course, everyone reads the Roswell found a flying saucer. This is not entirely a flying saucer. Do you?
The problem with this is it was based on evidence provided by a guy named Frank Kaufman. Kaufman turned out not to be the most credible of sources. And so we really don't have a good idea of exactly what the craft looked like. Other than you append the term flying saucer to anything that seems to be an alien spacecraft now, whether it's saucer shaped or cigar shaped or triangular shaped or whatever the shape is, you think of it as a disc, a flying saucer. I did a book not that long ago called Roswell in the 21st Century. What I did was I looked at the Roswell case as a cold case. What all do we know? What all has changed since the books came out starting in 1990, first with Don Schmitz and my book, UFO Crash at Roswell, and then our Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell and Crash at Corona by Stan Friedman.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that one.
Other books like that. Well, the problem, Stan got caught in the same trap we did. We believed that Frank Kaufman was telling the truth, and he turned out not to be telling the truth. And Stan believed Gerald Anderson not to be the most candid person on the planet either. So we've got to come and fight those demons. But I looked at the Roswell case from the point of view of the cold case. Where's the evidence today? Where does the evidence take it? The evidence isn't as robust today as it was back in the 90s, simply because people like Frank Kaufman turned out not to be telling us the truth. Glenn Dennis turned out not to be telling us the truth. And so I looked at all of that in the book and brought forward exactly how we got to the point where we are today.
Glenn Dennis, for those people who are unaware, was the mortician, right? And the story that he allegedly told was that he went on base after getting a phone call about some child-sized caskets, hermetically sealed. And supposedly when he came on base, he ran into a nurse that he'd known. He met her later. She apparently drew the being's, large eyes and big head, and then mysteriously died. But what really happened with him? Was he even on base?
I don't think so. With Glenn Dennis, he in 1947, he was not a mortician. He was an embalmer, which is a fine hair to split.
Yeah.
But one that I was split nonetheless. And the story you tell is essentially correct, that he went onto the base. We could never figure out why you had to have child-sized caskets. Even if the bodies are small, you can put them in a full-size.
Thank you. Even if they're 3 feet, you could fit them in a 6-foot casket. It makes no sense.
Well, you could put two together, that sort of thing. But that was his story. And as we looked into it, he talked about the nurse. He gave me the name, and he tells me, when he gives me the name of the nurse, he says, don't tell anybody the name. I promised I would never reveal who it was, but her name is Naomi Self. Next thing I know, Philip Class, the great debunker, he's got the name. I don't know where well, I think he got it from Carl Flock, who got it from Glenn Dennis, blabbing his mouth. We did a massive search for a nurse named Naomi Self and never could find one. A guy named Vic Golubek got a roster with 125,000 women who'd served in the military as nurses, and there was no Naomi Self.
Wow.
He said he was killed in an aircraft accident sometime after this, in the months after this. I went through the New York Times index back in the days when you couldn't go to Google and say, tell me about aircraft accidents. I had to go to the University of Iowa Library, and the New York Times published a big, huge book index, and you could look up aircraft accidents. I couldn't find it. I could find nothing like that. But Don Berliner went to Stars and Stripes. Now, Stars and Stripes is a newspaper printed overseas for military people. When I was in Iraq, we got the Stars and Stripes every day, which I looked forward to because Calvin's and Hobbes was in the. But he couldn't find it. Vic Golubek couldn't find the name. When Vic finally confronted Glenn Dennis with this and said that we could find no nurse named Naomi Self, he changed the story. He said, well, I told you guys at the time I wouldn't give you the name. I'd give you a name, but it wouldn't be the real name. And I'm thinking, no, he never told me that. And in fact, one day he was berating me because we hadn't found his nurse. I was talking to him, and he was talking, how come you haven't found my nurse? And I said, well, we've been looking for her. Just today, I talked to a guy named Robert Slusher, who was on one of the crews that flew material out of Roswell. Mm-hmm. I said, I talked to a guy named Robert Slusher. Turned out it's not the right guy. The guy I talked to had been a major during the Second World War and flown bombers. He was not a crew chief or a loadmaster on not commercial, but military cargo planes. And Glenn Dennis says to me, oh, I know Bob Slusher. He lives over in Alamogordo. Or Las Cruces, over in Las Cruces, and I called him up and was the right guy. So it's kind of that weird thing that worked out. But the point simply is he changed the name. And at that point, I said, no, I don't believe the story anymore. We've never found the nurse. I know I know Tom Carey thinks he's found a nurse who worked in a clinic in Roswell at the time, but her name wasn't Naomi Self, and I think they revealed the name in one of their books that they just published. I say one of their, Don Schmitz and Tom Carey's book. Publishes the name. I don't buy that that's the nurse, but so I think the Glenn Dennis tale was
fabricated.
Well, I was going to say manipulated only because we were told that there had been a mortician involved in Roswell, and I was talking to Walter Hott about this. And Walter said to me, I know the name you're fishing for. It's Glenn Dennis. And then we talked to Glenn Dennis, and he was very reluctant to talk to us, supposedly. It turned out he would talk to anybody who came and confronted him, but he, the story was always very reluctant to talk. And the story just didn't hang together. And I think if you look at it from a dispassionate point of view, you have to say, when so many facts do not jive with reality, you have to reject the tale. And so I reject the Glenn Dennis story, just as I reject the Gerald Anderson story for similar reasons. Too many of the things he said do not jive with reality.
You're actually explaining a very common principle in law. It's when you impeach a witness. Essentially, if you prove on the stand that they lied about something, you can throw away all their testimony. That's generally what you tell the jury. Discard their testimony because they lied about this.
But from our point of view, we weren't in a court of law and we weren't in front of a jury, but what we were looking at, and I understand people massages the stories, and each time you access a memory, it does subtly alter in your mind. And the best example, I've got a blog called Vietnam Ground Zero, and it's about my relatively true experiences in Vietnam. And I say relatively true because this is what I remember about happened. And the story I would tell people for years that we left our Thanksgiving dinner in the serving line because the flight crews had been scrambled on Thanksgiving. Well, my mother had kept all the letters I wrote home from Vietnam. And looking at that, I read the letter about what we did on Thanksgiving. We weren't in our company area to be scrambled. We had been deployed to Tain In, and we were waiting for something to happen in Tain In, and we were told we'd be given a good meal up in Tain In, and we got a real crappy one according to my letter. But what I say is relatively true. Yeah, we did get scrambled out of the mess hall a number of times, so we left our meals on the table or in the serving line, and that did in fact happen. It just didn't happen on Thanksgiving as I had thought. So that's why I say relatively true, as best I can remember, based on the letters I sent home and things like, and other things that I had written in the past that helped me put down as accurately as I can the information about my experiences in Vietnam. But the point simply is, I'm not lying about this stuff. It's just the memories are flawed, and I have to go back and look at where the evidence takes me. So when I say we left the Thanksgiving meal, no, we didn't do that, but we had done it other times.
Now, let's talk about another key component of the story. And in this new investigation you did where you looked at it as a cold case, did you ever come across the theory that Stanton Friedman talked about, that there were two craft that crashed? Or did you find that it was just one that hit the ground, spread the debris, and then landed somewhere else?
I think what happened was when Bill Moore and Stan Friedman were doing the investigation back in the 1980s, the only story they had of a crashed flying saucer was the Barney Barnett tale. Mm-hmm. Barney Barnett was a soil conservation engineer living in, I wanted to say Socorro.
The geologist, right? Barney Barnett.
Soil conservation engineer. I guess he lived in Socorro, and part of his area was out on the plains of San Augustine, and he was telling the story that he had come across a crashed flying saucer on the plains of San Augustine back in the early years. Bill Moore talked to a guy named Fleck Danley. I talked to the guy too. And Fleck Danley said, well, I think it was in 1947. So they have a link to a crash on the plains of San Augustine. And in this tale, Barney Barnett talks about the bodies being found. In the Roswell case at that point, we didn't have anybody who was talking about bodies. And they needed to link the two stories to get to the extraterrestrial beings. And the only connection was Fleck Danley saying, yeah, I think he talked about it in 1947. The problem is we found a diary that Ruth Barnett kept in 1947. It's the only year she kept the diary, and apparently somebody had given her a daily reminder book, and she religiously kept the diary for the entire year, so we could go back and look at that. And there's absolutely nothing to suggest that Barney Barnett was involved in any kind of flying saucer crash on the plains of San Augustine in 1947. I think that it's a tale that is much later. And I think Moore was pushing Danley to get it related to 1947 so they'd have the connection. And then, of course, Stan bought on with that. And later on, I think he was so invested in the San Augustine aspect of it, the plains of San Augustine aspect of it, that he was unwilling to let go of it. We found a guy, Herbert Dick, who was a anthropologist, archaeologist. He turned out he was in a place called Bat Cave, and I always hesitate saying that because people say Bat Cave.
Yeah, Bat and Robin, yeah.
But it's on the eastern side of the plains of San Augustine. He was there starting on July 1st. Now, the crash supposedly on the plains of San Augustine took place sometimes after July 2nd. So he was there to do it. I mentioned this to Stan one day, and Stan says, well, we don't know how deep they were in the cave, and we don't know what way, what direction the cave was facing. And I said, yes, we know all of that. He said he's looking for human habitation, ergo he's in the front part of the cave because they didn't have flashlights and way to light the back parts of the cave. So they stayed in the front, and the cave faced to the west. But the only camping area they had was about 100 yards away from that, downslope, the only level area facing the plains of San Augustine. He was in a perfect position to see all this activity that Gerald Anderson talked about, had it actually happened. I have a picture of Don Schmidt standing on the place that Gerald Anderson picked as where the crash took place. And behind him, you can see the mountains and you can see where the Bat Cave would have been. So I think Stan was very invested in that. And when we got the diary and there was nothing to suggest that, Stan said, well, it was a secret and he was probably told not to tell his wife. Well, according to what Stan published was a guy named Vern Maltese and his wife, Jean. And I think I'm not even sure they're still alive, come to think of it, but they eventually got divorced. We're at a Thanksgiving meal where Barney Barnett supposedly talked about this. But there's nothing in Ruth Barnett's diary during the Thanksgiving meal to talk about it either. So that kind of eliminates 1947, and it removes it from the idea that it has anything to do with the Roswell crash. When we move back into Roswell, we do have some tales now of bodies being recovered. It wasn't recovered in the Brazil debris field. There was another site where the rest of the craft impacted and the bodies were recovered. And we have people who saw the bodies at Roswell Army Airfield before they were airlifted out. We have
Walter Haut, right?
Well, no, well, he later, I was going to say he didn't see them, but later on he did say that. He spent like 30 years telling us I never saw them. I just wrote the press release, and all of a sudden, I saw the bodies. If you listen to the interview where he talks about that, he contradicts himself in the space of one paragraph and sometimes in the space of one sentence about what he saw. But again, on my blog, there's a story about the affidavit that Don Schmidt prepared, and I have no problem with Don preparing the affidavit.
You mean the 5 year after he died one, right? Because there was two, wasn't there? One right after
Yes, there was one that was done back in the early 1990s where he just said, I did the press release and that's all I know. And then later on, Don Schmidt and Tom Carey were interviewing him. Halt eventually told, I think it was Wendy Connor and Dennis Balsizer, about being involved in are seeing the bodies, and this is the interview that they talk about. And then Don prepared an affidavit from that information and his interviews with Walter Haut. I have no problem with Don writing out the affidavit. I don't, because Walter read it over and approved of it, and his daughter Julie was there as well and approved of it. So it's not like Don was making stuff up and Walter Haut was incapable of realizing what had been done. So I have no problem with that, but it contradicts his earlier affidavit, which would impeach him.
Yeah. Because,
which is the true story now, Walter? You spent, 20 years telling me, I didn't see the bodies. Now you're saying you did. But there's always a caveat to this. I talked to a guy in the mid-1990s named Harris. Mm-hmm. He was a financial officer at the Roswell Army Airfield. And this story's laid out on my blog. And a picture of Harris is there and everything. And he was talking to me, and he said that Walter Haut said to him, they were in the hangar, and he said, you want to see the bodies? They're on the other side of that door. And Harris said, well, he put his hand on the door and he decided he didn't want to see the bodies. I'm thinking I'd have been through that like a shot.
Yeah, me too.
But I can also understand, you don't want to see something like that. You don't know how badly mangled the bodies might be. But of course, they're not human, so there wouldn't be that kind of, I guess, horror you might see. And in today's age, when we see that on the screen all the time, I don't think anybody would really mind it that much. But he didn't do it. But the point simply is, Harris told me about that prior to Walter Haut saying that he'd seen the bodies. So we have a way of kind of corroborating it. And that's what I mean when you look at it dispassionately. Well, do we eliminate Walter Haut because his tale of seeing the bodies contradicts what he said earlier? His interview is not very well conducted because of the way things went, and I don't blame either Wendy Connor or Dennis Baltheiser. I think it was called Walter Haut was basically descending in dementia at the time. He was not as sharp as he had been. But so do we reject Walter Haut completely because of that? Or do we say, well, maybe for some reason he felt it necessary to conceal the idea that he'd seen the bodies up until he felt comfortable in revealing that information. So we got to look at all of that sort of thing when we're looking at the UFO case. And when we look at it dispassionately, we have to say that these things all play on it. It's not like we can eliminate Walter Haut's testimony because of that. We have to look at all of those sorts of things. And as an attorney, you would know when people are on the stand how to go about impeaching testimony, and then rehabilitating the testimony. So I've now impeached the Walter Haut testimony, but I've attempted to partially rehabilitate it. And so when I'm taking a dispassionate look at it, all that information is not that I'm engaging in a debate with somebody about the legitimacy of the Roswell case. I'm looking at the evidence, all the evidence, the totality of that evidence, and I'm not rejecting some of it, or I'm not forgetting about some of it, so that I can prove my point.
Now, a term that's been thrown around a lot, clearly because it's true, or a phrase, is the race with the Undertaker. Literally, I think we lost that race because there is no witness aside from the children anymore that are alive. I mean, we lost Jesse Marcel Jr. 8 years ago. That was the last person I know that actually held something that went public about it.
Well, there was a guy named Thornbridge, I think it was. Throwbridge? I don't remember the name completely accurately, because he said that he had been in Jesse Marcel's house the night that Jesse brought them stuff back. And
So he saw this, the big one, obviously, with the symbols on it.
Yes. And but talking to Jesse Marcel Jr. about this, and talking to Vo Marcel, talking to others, there was nobody playing bridge at the house. He wasn't there, but his obituary said, and I think it was 6 years ago, his obituary said the last known person to have handled the debris. I think not. I don't think he handled the debris. I think if there's anybody left around, I talked to a guy who was in Squadron S. Now you have to remember, Squadron S, back in 1947, the service was segregated, which means simply that the African-American soldiers were in their own units. They were not mixed. They were led by white officers, but they were in their own units. There was a Squadron S in Roswell, which was made up of the African Americans. So they had the NCOs there. I got into a fight with somebody about it. I said, well, there were no black NCOs in the Air Army in 1947. I said, would you like to see pictures of 24 of them?
And at the most prestigious base in the entire world.
Yeah. But they were also relegated to an awful lot of the crappy details. And that's what they did. They would be cleaning out the trash cans. And I think that oftentimes they were just not seen. They would be in the room, but they wouldn't be seen. They wouldn't be acknowledged. So they would hear a lot of things. And I talked to a couple of these guys a number of years ago. I think one of the guys I talked to was 89 and just really sharp about what, and said, well, we were told not to talk about it. And so we've got some of that. There may be one or two people like that who would have been 18 years old back in 1947 who could still be alive, that may know something about it. And there may be people who were assigned to the base in 1947 who were very young at the time, who may have heard things. But getting to the point where we're going to find somebody who's a firsthand witness to part of it, I think we've that race is over. Now we're into the secondhand testimony. I just don't like secondhand testimony.
Neither do I, especially because it's like the telephone game. Before we're going to run out of secondhand witnesses, we're going to go to third-hand witnesses. So it's
and some of that's being done, and the grandchildren of them, and the people may be relating precisely what they understood was said to them, which may not be exactly what was said to them. Or misunderstood something. If you're a child of 10, 12 years old and your father's telling you this tale of an alien spacecraft, what he's using in the way of terminology you as a youngster may not understand. I know Frankie Rowe, whose father was the firefighter who
she was 5, right?
No, she was 12.
Okay, yes. I wrote her down. Thank you for bringing her up.
Well, Frankie Rowe is a really nice lady. She passed away a year ago, or 2 years ago. A real nice lady who helped us out in our investigation, handled a piece of the debris, and told us the story of her father going out. And so there was always, well, did the Roswell Fire Department go out on a run out to see the crash flying saucer? Would there be documentation? I went through the records at the fire department. They were very cordial about showing me the records, and no, there's nothing there about it. And I know that Carl Flock in his book about Roswell would say, well, the fire department wouldn't be making a run outside the city limits, because he was told by a councilman, Max Littell, that they didn't make runs outside the city limits. Well, I asked the firefighters about that. They said, well, what are we supposed to do? Let it burn?
Yeah.
So but the point is, Carl talked to a firefighter who was there in 1947. I talked to the guy as well. Carl got the information he wanted and hung up. I asked an additional question. The guy says, no, we didn't make the run out to the fire department. And I said, did you know Dan Dwyer, Frankie Rowe's father? And he said, oh, yeah, Dan went out. I said, what? He said, yeah, Dan went out. Some colonel had come by the fire department. I'm thinking, yeah, it's always a colonel. It's never a captain, never a major, never a sergeant. It's always a colonel. And there weren't that many fools in Roswell at 1947, by the way. And told us we didn't need to go out. They had it handled. But Dan went out in his private car. And I'm thinking, Carl, did you know that? Or did you not ask the question I asked that elicited that response? I think Carl probably got the information he wanted and gave up on the conversation. I asked the additional questions and got the follow-on information. But what that does is it validated Frankie Rose Taylor, her father, going out there. It explained why there was no notation in the fire records and all of those sorts of things. Now, Don and Tom in their book, Witness to Roswell, talk about another guy who went out with Dan Dwyer in some kind of a makeshift pumper truck. He had a big vat in the back of like a truck that they drove around. And I said to Don, I don't believe that story. And he said, why not? And I said, because Frankie Rose and her father went out, or the fire department said he went out in his car. And he didn't go out with anybody else, you know. So, but I mean, that kind of gets to your point where I'm sure that the kid misunderstood what his father told him. And according to the city documents, the guy wasn't a firefighter in the Roswell Fire Department at the time this took place. So we look at all of that kind of stuff.
Another person I've written down, of course, is Pappy Henderson. Can you tell us his role in the incident?
Pappy Henderson was one of the pilots that flew material out of Roswell. Now, his wife, and Stan and I both interviewed her at length. Sappho Henderson said that he'd flown the bodies out. I'm not sure he did. He may well have, but he did fly debris out of Roswell. And the story she tells, which is really kind of marvelous, he said that they were in the grocery store, and he found one of the tabloid newspapers.
Weekly World News or something. Bat Boy Alive.
No, not the Weekly World News, because they made stuff up.
Yeah.
But more like the Inquirer that. And I know when Bob Pratt worked for the Inquirer, he was very careful about the UFO stories he published. In fact, he called me a couple of times about stories to verify the information, and then would send me a check for helping him out. And I thought that was very cordial of him.
Yeah.
But one of those old tabloid newspapers, and it was the interview with Jesse Marcel. Mm-hmm. And he gave her the paper. He says, "Read this." And when she was done, she says, "Yeah, I've been wanting to tell you about this for years, but I couldn't because I sworn to secrecy." But I guess if they're publishing in the newspapers, I can tell you now. Technically, he couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though it's now out in the public arena, you cannot verify what you've learned through classified sources. But
yeah, is it still a 10-10 agreement? 10,000 years punishment, 10 years in prison. Is that was instrumental?
No, it's not, I think it's 2020 now. But
2020. Okay.
But there's also part where that does not apply because top secret material isn't necessarily downgraded. Secret material is normally downgraded at 3-year intervals, which means after 3 years it's downgraded to confidential, and after 3 years it becomes for official use only, so that it gets out in the public arena. Top secret, it has to be reviewed and downgraded. Mm-hmm. And so, if you spill it, you end up going to jail when you spill it. And I'm not sure whether if it would be only 10 years. But the other side of that coin is, so you spilled the big secret about the alien crash at Roswell, and the question becomes then, do you want to prosecute this guy because you're admitting it's true?
Yeah.
We just deny it and
discredit them. That's what they do.
Well, he wasn't a real good soldier. Had a tendency to make stuff up and things like that. But you have to be very careful what you prosecute, because you don't want the people to realize, well, we're prosecuting this guy, but the story's not true. Well, if it's not true, why do you prosecute him?
That's true. What do you think about Col Philip Corso?
Not much and not often.
Repeat that?
Not much and not often.
Okay, so the story that he claimed 50 years plus, I believe, after the incident in the Day After Roswell book.
It's poppycock. When we were deploying to Iraq, by strange coincidence, our power projection platform was Fort Riley, Kansas. Mm-hmm. So I spent 3 months at Fort Riley. But the idea back in 1947, and we were running convoys in a similar way. We were carrying automatic weapons across state lines when we went from our home station to Fort Riley. And we had to cross a number of state lines with automatic weapons. So I know what kind of troubles we had with the documentation. And now you're bringing top secret material out of Roswell heading toward Wright Field. At that time, they remain overnight at Fort Riley. and they're not using their own guards. They did unload the trucks and bring some of the stuff into a building and don't have it guarded by their own men. I'm not believing that at all. There's no reason to unload the trucks. And so there's no way that he would have seen the bodies, because had I been running the convoy, my own people would have been guarding the trucks. Sure, they've traveled all day and we'd run 2-hour shifts. When we were convoying to Baghdad out of Kuwait, we did the exact same thing. We would remain overnight in areas, and we ran our own guards as we were doing it. Yeah, there were guards on the perimeter, all of this jazz, but we guarded our own equipment as we went forward.
Well, as I would think you would, especially in a case like this, because you would have to read more people into the security clearance just to guard something like this.
Well, actually, not to guard. You just guard it and don't look, but you've got your own guys there, so you don't need to do that. And then he talks about, well, I was on the bowling team with these NCOs, and I'm thinking, not in 1947, you weren't, because the military was very, very structured at the time. When I first got in the Army in 1967, God, I hate to say that.
Yeah, well.
67. We still had that split. You had an officers club, you had an NCO club, and you had an enlisted man's club. And the enlisted guys didn't go to the officers club, and the NCOs didn't go to the officers club, and the officers didn't go to the NCO club. You would not be mixing that way, and it was much more strict in 1947 than it was when I got in, because it had loosened up. And of course, in aviation, that all kind of fell apart because we were all kind of relying on each other. When we got over into Vietnam, we were relying on each other to keep ourselves alive. So we were a little bit more friendly. And then going to Iraq, there were just now service clubs where everybody sort of went in and mingled, which I think is a good way to build teams, which is the idea of, and we're running into this again. We had, before I got out, we had a number of sexual harassment seminars.
Wow.
And, how not to talk to the female soldiers and vice versa. And as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, this is not doing us any good, because it is inhibiting the building of a team.
Yeah.
And one of the instructors asked me after the class what I thought of it. And that's exactly what I said. I said, what you're doing is you're preventing us from building teams. When we got to Iraq, we had a fairly strong female contingent. And they were given the option of having a female tent from all the companies, and all the women would be together, or they could stay with their companies. A lot of them, so you'd have a mixed male and female contingencies in these tents when we got to Kuwait before we deployed into Iraq, which, by the way, wasn't very comfortable because there was no air conditioning in the tents.
Yeah, I would think, especially in the desert, the very hot desert.
Yeah, but it got really cold at night, so it wasn't all that bad. But the point simply is the women opted to stay in the tents with the men. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking this is good for building teams. And so you have to think of those sorts of things. And and that was why I think that, when we were in Iraq, in Vietnam, for example, I know the flight crews would have a band come in to play or a show come in, and they would invite the pilots to come to the show. The only caveat was don't wear anything with your rank on it.
Yeah.
And the reason it was kind of funny for me is I met a friend of mine from high school in one of these parties, and I was basically, in fatigue pants and a t-shirt, and he didn't realize I was an officer.
Oh, yeah.
And so we had a nice chat. And he says he ran the tower, Tay Ninh Tower. We called it Tay Ninh Tower Power because this was the 60s. We did that, and he invited me up to the tower one night. So I went up, and he was astonished to see that I was a pilot. So. But I mean, the point is, you're building a team that way. But in 1947, it was much more structured. And the field grade officers didn't really congregate with the company grade officers, and vice versa. There was an awful lot of the stratification that way.
I would think so, especially being so close to World War II. And the structure, the patriotism. If you were an officer, you wanted to be in that exclusive club. You didn't want to mix with, say, enlisted men.
Well, I think in the combat arenas, then you're depending on one another, and the camaraderie is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. But when you end up at Fort Riley and there's nobody shooting at you, you don't have the same sort of camaraderie and same sort of team building. So I think that when Corso talks about how this sergeant approached him and says, you want to see something really strange? And I'm thinking, if I'm Corso, then I'm obligated now to say, this guy has broken the security here, and we have got to do something about that. We cannot let that go. That sort of thing. I just don't buy the story. But in his book, he's got a picture of UFO seen in, I think, Southern California. And I looked at the picture and I said, everybody knows it's a fake. The guy who took it said it's a fake. The Project Blue Book file said it's a fake. So everybody, I think it was a picture that appeared in a Look magazine.
Oh.
On flying saucers, and it's in there as well. And it just explains the whole thing with this picture was fake. And the other thing, you learn that 99% of the pictures were taken by teenage boys. 99% of those are faked, because that's what teenage boys do.
That's true. That's very true.
I think that you have to keep all of that in mind. And Corso just didn't have a grasp of the sort of thing that you'd expect. I saw him in Roswell, and he was talking about how he had been the commander at White Sands Missile Range. Mm-hmm. No, you were never the commander at White Sands Missile Range. The commander is a general officer with two exceptions. One was the first guy out there, was a guy named Turner. And the second one was a colonel. The general who was in charge died of a heart attack, and the senior colonel took over until they could get a new general in there. And you weren't that guy. So he said things like that. Now, if he'd said I had been a commander at White Sands, meaning he commanded a battalion, I said, yeah, fine. I got no problem with that. But there was just so many things he said. And then there was the big kerfuffle over the introduction written by Senator Strom Thurmond. And Thurmond was outraged when the book came out. He says, this is not the book I was told about. He was doing something for an officer he knew. And he said, would you write an introduction? He said, yes. And they plug it in his book, and they had to remove it. So, Corso just didn't have the knowledge you'd expect him to have. He did not seem to understand how some of these things worked. And I think had he stuck to his original plan, which was the book he was going to write was something called I Walked with Giants, which was supposed to be his interaction with some of the famous people from World War II, which would have been an interesting book.
Yeah, whatever.
But I also got a copy of the proposal that they had sent in. And I say Corso had sent in, and this is going to get me into another bit of trouble. And he said that he had served with MJ-12. And I'm thinking, no, you didn't.
Yeah.
And the editor who sent it to me said, what do you think of this guy? And I said, he's not telling the truth. And the editor's probably mad at me because they passed on the book and it turned out to be a bestseller, but it just wasn't the truth.
Yeah, sometimes the truth doesn't sell as much as lies and fantasy. As you can see, there's a couple of questions here. I put up one on the screen. I'll read it in case you want, or you could read it. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can read it. You probably do it better than I.
Welcome to the show. Asks Kevin, what single piece of evidence would you present to support the Roswell incident?
There is no terrestrial explanation that fits all the facts. There's some very good eyewitness testimony. I'm thinking of Bill Brazel, who talked to Don and me about what he had seen and what he had done. I think of Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, and that's like the chief of police in a town at Roswell, talking about that. And I asked him at one point, he was very careful in what he said to us because he didn't want to violate his oath, the oath that he had taken. And I said to him at one point, are we following the right path? And he said to me, what do you mean? I said, well, we think it's extraterrestrial. He said, well, let me put it this way. It's not the wrong path. And essentially telling me it was extraterrestrial. We have any number of people saying they were sworn to secrecy, and some of them wouldn't talk to us at all because of that oath. Some of them felt that, like Pappy Henderson felt that after all these years, they could tell us what they had seen and what they had done. So I think you've got the eyewitness testimony of some very credible people who were in very high positions at Roswell in 1947. Every member of General at the time, Colonel Blanchard's staff that we talked to, with one exception, basically told it was extraterrestrial. Marcel, Patrick Saunders. In fact, Don and I, we had two paperbacks. Our first book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was a paperback, and then Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell was hardback, and it came out in paperback. He sent copies of the flyleaves of the paperbacks to friends and family, and one of them, it said, here's the damage control. Is talking about what Saunders did as the base adjutant to cover up the movement of the people and the expenditures of the money. And he wrote on there in his own handwriting, "This is the truth, and I never told anybody anything," and he signed it. I go, there's a nice piece of documentation. True, it came out after our book came out and that sort of thing, but there's no motivation for him to lie about it at that point. I talked to him a couple of times, and he was very circumspect in what he said to us about that. But so that would be one of the best pieces of evidence we have. The fact that the Air Force came out in 1995 and said
it, yeah, and literally said it.
Back in 1947, we said it was a weather balloon, and we lied about it. But what it really was a weather balloon.
Yeah,
we just dressed it up in a new name, but it was the same explanation, and it didn't make any sense then as well. What we would like to have is a hunk of debris that could be conclusively proven that it was extraterrestrial origin. The thing that's always frightened me on this is we get a real live, honest to God piece of a flying saucer. I mean, this is it. We've got a piece of a flying saucer. We take it in to be tested, and they say, yeah, it's aluminum.
Yeah. Like what Linda Moulton Howe has, 99.9% aluminum, which again, what does that really prove?
Well, and then we had the thing at the 50th anniversary where they had a piece of debris, and they brought in the scientist who tested it and said the isotopic ratios don't match anything in nature, ergo it must be extraterrestrial. And then you begin talking to other scientists, and they says, yeah, it's artificial, but we could make it here.
We can make it, yeah.
It's not something that's impossible for us to make. The best thing we had going for us was this Ubatuba sample, which was seen to fall into the Atlantic Ocean off Ubatuba in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is
you mean the recent crash in Brazil?
No, this was 1957.
Okay.
But the chain of custody is broken. But when it was tested, they said it was a magnesium of a purity that could not be obtained at that time. I mean, when they tested it we can't do this. The Condon Committee looked at it and said, well, we talked to Dow Chemical, and they said they could do it, but it was in a very expensive process and a very technically oriented process, and they didn't explain where guys in Brazil would have gotten samples of their metal, even if it existed in 1947 in this fashion. So we have something like that, but what we need is something that we've got the chain of custody, and we say we couldn't create this now, and sometime later by looking at it, yes, well, now we can do this sort of thing.
Before I get to the next question, let me make a comment about eyewitness testimony. I know because we live in the modern day world and we have smartphones, everyone expects everything to be caught on camera. Let's remind everybody that for hundreds of years, people were sentenced to death off eyewitness testimony alone. If you got two eyewitnesses, one to corroborate the other, or say 3 or 4, that person would be electrocuted or hung, etc. So eyewitness testimony is very, very powerful, especially when you got multiple sources who didn't collude to conspire to tell the story and independently said something that is verifiable from the other person.
Well, but when we get to Roswell, it's not just one guy or two guys. It's a whole bunch of guys.
That's what makes it even more compelling.
Of the chain. You're not talking to privates who may be 18, 19, 20 years old and are in it for a lark. You're talking to career officers who've been in, and the people we talked to had all been in World War II. So they were very reliable people, and they're not going to be talking about making these claims if they weren't sure of what they were saying.
Here's another question for you, and after this one, I have a follow-up about this before I get to the next person's question. This is from Lasha Senyak. It says, what does the colonel think was going on with that famous photo of Marcel holding the tinfoil weather balloon stuff?
That was staged. That was to get the press off their back. And both Jesse Marcel said that photo was staged. He was in the room. He ought to know.
Yeah.
And Colonel Dubose, who was the chief of staff of the 8th Air Force at the time, very prestigious position, and retired as a brigadier general. He's in the room with Roger Ramey. We talked to both of those guys, and Dubose said the picture was staged. The picture was staged to tell the press that there's nothing to this and go somewhere else. Go on to another story. And what you've got is you've got a lower headquarters, which was the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell, saying, we've got a flying saucer. It's taken to a next higher headquarters where it's examined by guys who supposedly are even better at what this stuff. And they said, well, it's just a weather balloon. It doesn't explain why Jesse Marcel was so dumb he couldn't recognize a weather balloon when he saw it. And Marcel said, yeah, that was it was what I was photographed with. Was a weather balloon. When it was pointed out to him what was going on, just this picture looks like a weather balloon. He says, yeah, that's not the stuff I brought from Roswell. And yet when it appeared in the Roswell incident, the pictures were cropped in such a way as you didn't see the entire photograph. I've held the negatives, for God's sakes, from those photographs. So I know exactly what the picture looks like, and I think I've got copies of those on my blog as well, the whole photograph. And you can see you can see the weather balloon envelope in the back by the radiator. It's a black pile of debris, and what they're looking at is a ray wind target that's been thoroughly torn apart. But the point is, when Jesse Marcel, the reporter was Johnny Mann. He was a reporter for WWL TV in New Orleans, ended up as a reporter in Amarillo, Texas. He closed out his career, and he took Marcel to Roswell, and they're talking about this, and he's got the Roswell incident book in his hand. He says, "Jess, gotta tell you, that looks like a weather balloon." And Marcel says, "That's not the stuff I brought from Roswell." And then you've got DuBose, who was in the room, saying, this stuff was switched. It wasn't the debris. The real debris went elsewhere. So that was just to kill the story. And then the next day, the important thing is the next day, the very next day, the Army and the Navy didn't care what the newspapers were saying about flying saucers. There's stories every day about them, many, many stories about them. The very next day, after the July 8th message, on July 9th, you see, I think it's an Associated Press story saying that the Army and the Navy moved to suppress the stories of the flying saucers whizzing through the atmosphere. Why suddenly on the July 9th did they care?
Because of what happened on July 7th and the 8th.
Yeah, precisely.
Now, about that famous photograph, something that's come about, I think, 14 years ago, 2007, I may be wrong about that date, was the technology where we are able to look at Raymies Memo. What do you think about the accuracy of what has been said about that?
Unfortunately, I think it's quite a bit faces in the clouds. I was at the last time that photograph was scanned, and they brought in equipment that took it down to the molecular level and built it up from there. I mean, the scanning process took hours, and it took little tiny photographs, and then they could put the whole composite together. And we were hoping by doing this, we'd be able to answer the question, does it say victims of the wreck? Or in another scan, another analysis said viewing of the wreck. Well, that's really different.
Yeah,
victims of the wreck. It just did not resolve the issue.
Was it that pixelated?
It gets down to, well, it's not really pixelated because you're dealing with a negative, but you've got the highlights of silver and the molecules of creating the film. So you're down in essence to a pixel type level. But the problem is it just could not be resolved. And the guy I was talking to said that the problem now is the technology is not going to evolve to a point where they're going to be able to do anything. They've done everything they can. They're going to have to apply some kind of an artificial intelligence to look at it, a supercomputer looking at it to fill in kind of the blanks to see if they can figure it out. He also said, if the guy had been a foot closer, or if Navy had turned the memo just a little bit, we could probably be able to read the whole thing. We can read parts of it. We can read Fort Worth, Texas. We can say it says weather balloons. We can read some of it. It's that critical line.
Yeah, the victims or viewing.
And I can see it both ways. When I look at it, I look at that and I say, yeah, I can see viewing and I can see victims. And at this point, we've done everything we can possibly do. I've been involved in 2 scans of the thing in the last 7 or 8 years. The last one 2 years ago, and it was just the state-of-the-art equipment. The guy came in from California, and he's got this massive thing, and he's taken the photograph. I mean, hours and hours. And once they get it down to that level, then they begin to recreate, build it up from that point. And unfortunately, when he built it up from that point, the line looked like it said dealing with the wreck.
Oh, wow. So a third interpretation, really,
Yeah,
literally.
well, I just don't know how legitimate that is. I know David Rudiak is convinced it says viewing victims of the wreck. I know Tom Carey is convinced it says victims of the wreck, and I can see that myself when I look at it. And I can also see viewing of the wreck, and that would be almost a smoking gun if it said victims of the wreck, because you're not going to have it's going to negate the weather balloon, because you're not going to have victims of a weather balloon crash.
Yeah, I know. If a weather balloon crash, what's it going to kill 3 people? It doesn't. A weather balloon is not going to hurt you.
Yeah, let's catch it as it comes down.
Yeah.
But we just cannot resolve it to the point where we can see exactly what it says, and it's going to take some other avenue of invention for us to be able to read that.
Here's a question that is not necessarily Roswell based, but still I'm asking it to you anyway. It relates to DUMBs, deep underground military bunkers. It's more of an engineering question, I guess, or a where is. But here it says, it's from Dean Weiss. Where is all the dirt after building underground tunnels below Area 51, etc.? So it doesn't even have to be about Area 51. I mean, whether it be under Wright Pat or Edwards or wherever.
You ever see The Great Escape?
The Great Escape?
You ever see the movie?
No.
Where they're digging the tunnels underneath the huts to get out of the prison camp, and they got to dispose of the dirt?
I've seen it in what they did in Shawshank Redemption. Just put them in their pockets and empty to the prison yard.
Well, that's what they did in The Great Escape. And did that sort of thing and put it elsewhere. But if you're building something like that, the place is under construction, you just put it in a big dump truck and drive it out.
That's true.
It's not a big. Well, we're building something here, and then you don't have to know how deep it's going. You just we're undergoing some excavations here, and we're building some stuff, and we're building the foundation for it. So there goes the dirt.
Here's another one from Welcome to the Show. Has anyone ever remote viewed the Roswell incident?
Yes.
And any results? Because I've seen that it could go either way, 50%, which is not really accurate. I could say anything is binary. I say, yeah, I've seen it, or I didn't see it, or, Yeah,
it depends on who you're talking to and what their bias is. I'm not a big fan of remote viewing. I just watched a Columbo episode where they explained how some of the remote viewing trickery works, which I thought was kind of funny. Just watched it yesterday, as a matter of fact. I think it's season 9, episode 1. For those of you who have Tubi and would like to go see that episode.
Oh, I love Columbo. I grew up on that.
But yeah, people have remote viewed it, and I've seen the stuff. It's just not the kind of evidence I would want to submit to anybody.
Another one here. Oh, well, actually, someone before that, real quick, kind of answers the question about the dirt. It turns it to glass. I know there's a nuclear boring machine that essentially is so hot as it bores tunnels. We're talking massive. I believe it's 3 stories tall in diameter. It's that big, and it essentially turns the tunnel walls into glass. Now, is that true or not? I don't know, but the photographs seem authentic, and they have been. It's floating around for years, actually.
Yeah, but they didn't have that in 1947.
Exactly. So. Thank you.
When the Trinity site, I guess they had glass there from the heat of the atomic explosion, but that's a whole different thing. No, I just not a big fan of the idea of great underground military bases and bunkers. They had a big bunker built under a hotel, the Greenbrier Hotel in, was it West Virginia? Mm-hmm. Or I should say West by God, Virginia. And how did they get the dirt out of there? Put it in the truck.
And drive it off, haul it off. Okay, Lasha Senyak asks, is it possible that it was actually an enemy military craft that was shot down and the military wanted to deflect so-called a balloon flying saucer, balloon/flying saucer?
If that was the true story, we would have known that in 1995. Because
Andy Jacobson.
1995 to keep it secret anymore.
That's true.
The only airplane, our competitors, the enemy in 1947 would have been the Soviet Union. They had some B-29s. A number of our B-29 bombers were forced down in Soviet Union. I say forced down, because of problems they had over Japan, and went to the Soviet Union, and so the Soviets ended up with B-29. So they built basically I think it was a Tu-4, which is basically a B-29, and it didn't have the range to get to New Mexico at the time, or barely had the range, so it could have crashed. But had it been that, then we would have been all over. When Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union in his U-2, the Soviets let us lie about, well, we're not flying spy planes over Russia, because he was supposed to destroy the plane and kill himself when he was shot down. And then the Soviets trotted him out and said, well, here's a guy. And so had it been an enemy plane like that, we'd have trotted it out and said, yeah, hey, they're spying on us here.
Absolutely, I would think so. And Annie Jacobson has been trying to float that theory around that it was, in fact, a Soviet disc, and it had essentially children that were, grown up with some sort of deformities and had some more surgeries to make them look like, not human. That theory was one of the laughing stock to me.
Nick Redfern came up with a similar idea called Body Snatchers in the Desert, I think was his book. We called it BS in the Desert. There's a review on my blog about it and why I don't buy his idea, but it was a Japanese prisoners of war flown because of Japanese experiments at Unit 731, I think it was. And when the war was over, we captured some of that stuff, and that was what it was. But there's just really no evidence of that. And then again, had it been something like that in 1947, when the Air Force was investigating in 1995, and they could trot something like that out, they would have done it at that time.
When you refer to 95, you're talking about when the Air Force released did their big Roswell investigation, a big thick book that they did, and then they did a smaller one. About the bodies 2 years later, right?
Yeah, and I always laugh at that because he used to prove that it was anthropomorphic dummies. He used the testimony of Jim Ragsdale, which we had said, no, Ragsdale wasn't telling the truth. But if you want to use that to prove your point, well, then you just shot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, because didn't they claim that people had memory problems, and even though the drop test dummies happened in the 50s, they somehow confused it in their memory, and it really...
Well, I can kind of understand people kind of conflating the events that way, but it doesn't make any sense when you're looking at if you're talking about a flying saucer. Well, we found these strange bodies some years later in the desert and blah blah blah, and the anthropomorphic dummies look nothing like the descriptions of the bodies that we got from the people who saw them. So it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, they're 6 feet tall, essentially 5'6", 5'6", or 5'12", something like that. Yeah, small head, nothing, big eyes, nothing like that.
Yeah, precisely.
Another question from you from Lasha Senyak. What is the Colonel's opinion about the recent Tic Tac report by the Navy?
Well, if you're talking about a 9-page high school report that they just released, saying, well, we looked at 144.
Yeah, that was very offensive to me.
Which may not be 100.
Uh-oh. Well, hope we didn't lose you. Let's find out. I hope we didn't lose Mr. Randle here. Okay, there you are. You got frozen for a second. We were worried we lost you. Anyway, yeah, I was very offended by that report because, as you mentioned earlier, they did nothing to talk about the history. They did not talk about, like, for instance, not just Roswell. What about other times where the military was involved? Why not bring up anything from Project Blue Book? What about the Socorro, New Mexico case?
Well, I think the one thing you have to remember, I think of this report as Twining 2.0. Back in September 1947, General Twining, who was the commander of the Air Materiel Command, and his intelligence guys were given 16 UFO reports, flying saucer reports, to analyze for General Shogun. Mm-hmm. And Twining wrote a letter on September 27th, I think it was 1947. Again, go to my blog, you can see it. And he said that the phenomenon, meaning the flying saucers, is something that is real and not visionary or visionary or fictitious. He's saying it's something real. This is 1947. Now, here we are again, and they're saying yeah, we got these reports. We don't know what it is. There's something real going on. We just don't know what it is. I'm waiting for him to come up with the Condon Committee report now, Condon 2.0, and say, well, we looked at the stuff and we were able to solve them all. So you all can go home. Nothing to see here. It's just show. I would like to know what's in the classified version, if it's any better. But I've said all along as well that it wouldn't be that difficult to have looked at the Project Blue Book files. I have in two binders, which, by the way, one of them they're sitting right here. This is a complete index of the Project Blue Book.
Wow. Yeah, I only have 14, the one that Dan Friedman used to sell.
No, this is Project Blue Book's index.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Yeah.
The whole thing. So you could go through this. You could go through this very, very quickly and pick out the good cases for evaluation. It wouldn't take you long to do it. And the other funny thing is, and I'm reaching up here, so pardon my armpit.
Oh, no worries.
This is, I have on this the complete Project Blue Book files.
Wow. What is that, 20,000 cases, I believe? Is that what they investigated?
It's just over 30,000, 13,000. I'm sorry, 13,000. There's like 135,000 documents.
Wow.
This is a 1 terabyte external hard drive, obviously. I can carry Project Blue Book around in my pocket, for crying out loud.
I know. Look at the way we've gone with technology.
Oh, yeah.
And that sort of begs the other question. Do you believe that we have seeded technology from what was recovered in Roswell, possibly into the military-industrial complex, which is then filtered out to us? Because to have something like this is AI. Maybe it's not connected to our body, but you could talk to this. You could say, play music. It'll tell you which way the wind blows. I mean, you'd literally, this is magic. 20 years ago, if you told me that I wouldn't be using a regular landline, that I'd have a smartphone with 500 gigabytes in my pocket, I would laugh at you.
Well, but it's not even that. It's better than the Star Trek communicator, because you can access the entire human knowledge on that device.
That's right.
If you know how to, if you got the right internet connections, you can find out. I mean, I've gotten to the point where if I have a hard time spelling a word, I just go to Google and type the word in.
And it fills it out for you. I know.
It tells me how to spell it correctly, that sort of thing. Yeah, the technology is amazing. But the other problem is we don't see anything that's a quantum leap. We can trace the evolution of that product being created, and you would think there'd be a sudden quantum leap. And I think the technology is so far superior. What we picked up at Roswell was so far superior, we have not yet figured it out. And the example I use, which unfortunately for the millennials isn't going to work anymore, but if you had a VCR,
yeah, I still have one,
and a TV and a power pack, and you go back to Merlin the Magician, and you show them the black ribbon of the videotape, and you say, you know the secret, you can get color pictures and sound off this. But to understand it, you have to you need to know about two things that are invisible: electricity and magnetism, to make it work. And so if you're presented with a technology that's like 500 years in the future for us, or even 100 years. Well, 50 years ago, you just said it, we couldn't imagine that I could carry around the entire Project Blue Book files in my pocket, because you couldn't imagine how you could cram all that data into such a small device.
Yeah.
And so I think that what has happened is we recovered the craft. They looked at it, they tried to figure it out, they couldn't do it. And as they realized it was so far superior to our technology, they put it on hold, and periodically they would look at it to see where our technology had developed to the point where we could understand their technology. And I don't think we've gotten to that point yet.
This is another one from Lasha. Is it true that in Russia they have a similar military program actually called Project Blue Book? Or even if they don't have it?
I don't think it was called Blue Book, but they did have an investigation.
I would think so, especially they were our adversary for what, 50 years?
But the UFOs, the flying saucers, weren't limited to the United States either. They were seen all over the world. One of the best wave of sightings was 1954 in France. Mm-hmm. They were getting cases with the electromagnetic effects and that sort of thing in 1954, like we got in 1957 in the desert Southwest. So yeah, they would have investigation. I don't know how many countries had investigations into UFOs. The Australians got screwed by our Air Force. they were wanting to put together an investigation of UFOs, and they'd read Don Kehoe's book. And so the Australians approached our Air Force, and our Air Force said, well, don't listen to Don Kehoe. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Turns out Don Kehoe exactly what he was talking about. Yeah. The information he presented in his books was pretty much accurate. But it convinced the Australians that there was nothing to it. And so, that was a way of, the people said, well, how come other countries haven't done it? Well, that's one of the ways it happened. We managed to suppress their investigation to a certain extent or downgrade it because of what our Air Force told to their Air Force.
With regards to Major Donald Kehoe, I'm always remembering that program, that television program he was on when he was about to say something and they muted him. Did you ever know what he said? I think
that if you go to Google and search that, you can find it. I think you can find the answer. Well, the interesting thing is I did a book called UFOs in the Deep State. Mm-hmm. And it came out not long ago. And if everybody go out and buy a copy of it, it could become the #1 book on the UFO thing. And I could maybe knock Jacques Vallée out of that position, which is my goal in life right now. But the point simply is it shows how this stuff has been suppressed for years. And that's one of the things that they had done to suppress it. You say, well, Jimmy Carter was going to look at UFOs and he's the president. He should be able to get the answers. And I would have said to you, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I found out how they do it. Carter, when he was president-elect, talked to a guy named Dan Sheehan. It's in
the lawyer, Daniel Sheehan, right?
Yeah, and it's in UFOs in the Deep State. And he met with Carter, and Carter told him that Carter was meeting with George H.W. Bush, who was director of Central Intelligence at the time. And Bush said he would like to remain on as the director of Central Intelligence. And Carter said, well, I'm sorry, I've got my own guy coming in. And then Carter asked him about UFOs. And he said, well, I'm going to tell you, you're not the president yet. You're going to have to wait till you're the president. You're going to have to follow the proper procedures to do that. I think by the time Carter got in, and the same people end up in positions of power from administration to administration. Look who's in the Biden administration today. Who was in the Obama administration?
Same people,
or the George W. Bush, or the Clinton administration. Same guys, or same people, I should say, in today's environment, running that. So the president comes to, and we've just seen an example of how they do that. Congress said we want a report within 180 days. What do they get? They get a high school book report to fulfill the requirement, but doesn't tell you anything. And that's how we've got to pull the information away from all these other agencies. We'll get back to you that. We'll just give us a chance to pull it. We want to make it a complete report. And then other things happen. With Carter, it was the hostage crisis. With Bill Clinton, it was Monica Lewinsky.
Yeah.
They can just divert attention and hope the president forgets about it and keep throwing we got this crisis over here. We got this crisis over there. We got to deal with. And I think that's the way they do it. And I kind of outlined this in UFOs in the Deep State on how they keep this information from the president. So I'm the president, I ask the questions, and they divert my attention. Of course, I'd be smart enough to say, well, yeah, you got 10 minutes to get the report to me because I know it's out there somewhere already.
Now, one thing that offends me is I'm glad I didn't get my hopes up, and forgive this logo. I don't know why the camera is not untoggling off, but hey, at least we're getting to the last 10 minutes. I didn't get my hopes up coming into this UAP report, but at the same time, I expected maybe another video, very grainy like the Tic Tac or Gimbal. We didn't get that, but nonetheless, I never got my hopes up back in, December, January. So come a week ago, I wasn't that hurt because I knew it was going to be something along the lines of, oh, well, we don't know what it is. We need more time to investigate. When you have a willing media, like you mentioned, that right there, they'll divert your attention anytime. There's a storm coming in Texas or Florida, tropical storm here. We're, airdrops in Syria or whatever's happening. Always a way to divert attention from what's really happening in the Oval.
And you go and in the book I talk about a number of presidents who said they were going to learn about UFOs and they never did.
Yep, including Reagan and Clinton.
Although Barack Obama has said some things that were kind of interesting in the last couple of years about UFOs, but didn't really get us to the point we wanted to go. But I just look at all of that stuff and how these things have gone on and how the government has been manipulated by those in power. There was almost a coup d'etat when Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, and there was a group of people who didn't want him as president, and they suggested to him what they were going to do is they're going to bring in a guy who'd be like his chief of staff. And a guy named Smedley Butler, who's a famous Marine general, two-star general, because Marines only had 2 stars back in the 1930s, 2-star generals. The guy had 2 medals of honor. He would have had 3, but the first incident, Marine officers were not authorized to get the Medal of Honor. He would have had 3. Only man in history would have had 3 medals of honor.
Wow.
Anyhow,
Yeah.
they were going to bring him in, and he would really run the country, and Roosevelt would be sort of the figurehead. And to Butler's credit, he said, I'm going to do that. And he went to the press and told them about it. And of course, the press kind of looked at it, and Congress investigated, and it was kind of one of those deals where, we don't think so. But I think that kind of points to the, in the United States, to one of the places where the deep state got kind of called out on what was going on. And so, you look at how things have transpired in the UFO field, and you say, well, why would they want to keep it secret? What's the problem here? And the answer is it's power.
Yeah.
Because every time a technologically superior civilization comes in contact with a technologically inferior civilization, the technological superior civilization ceases to exist. And it doesn't have to be through conquest. It's the mere introduction of the technology. Look what happened to a number of the native tribes here in the United States when the Europeans showed up. A steel pot or an iron pot is a much better cooking vessel than a clay pot. And a rifle, even a musket, is a much better weapon in many circumstances than a bow and arrow.
Or a spear or a knife or anything that requires up close and personal.
And the other thing is the civilization, the cultures of the plains tribes changed significantly because of the introduction of the horse. Up until the 16th century, there were no horses in the New World, and the Spanish brought new horses over, and they got loose and bred like they were rabbits.
That's why we have wild Mustangs now, right?
Yes, absolutely. But the point simply is that altered their culture and their civilizations at that point. So I think that you admit that there's alien presence here, and we've got a recovered flying saucer. That's going to reduce their power because people are be looking at things a little bit differently. So I think that's part of the reason we still have the cover up today, because it's all retaining the power, and with power comes money and prestige. And we don't want to if you've got those, you don't want to give them up.
74 years later, I think me, you, and everybody else is entitled to go see it in a museum. We should be able to see the wreckage, touch it, maybe see some videos and footage. It really belongs in a museum. I get it why, but at the same time, does anyone in, say, ATIP have access to this technology? I don't think so. I think it's buried up, so locked up in black projects that I don't even know if people in power can get to it now. What's your take on that?
There will be people in power who control it, and they will pass that power on to their followers when it becomes time to do so. But it's all about power, and it's all about retaining power. Look at where the presidents come from. Where did they go to college?
Yale, Harvard.
Yeah, and it's all set up that way. And how many times have we had Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt?
Yep.
We've had the Bush boys in there.
And remember, Bush W was at Yale at the same time in the Skull and Bones as John Kerry was, and they were rival candidates in 2004.
Yes. And so we looked at all of that stuff and manipulate the system to retain their power. And although I think the UFO aspect of it is a very, very small part of the whole thing, by allowing a little bit of that power to seep away, they're letting a little bit of that power seep away, and they're not going to take that risk. They're going to continue to suppress that information as best they can. And all we can do is take a look at it and try to present the evidence as best we can with the proper sourcing and the proper information. so people can take a look at it and say, yeah, these guys are right. They know what they're talking about. We can follow that chain of evidence. We can follow that chain of footnoting so that we can see that, yeah, this guy didn't make this. He didn't claim that he fought for 20 years on Mars. By the way, according to somebody,
I've heard that three different people.
Those of us who were in Iraq weren't really in Iraq. We were in Mars, on Mars. And I attest to that because, I was there and I thought it was amazing that Walmart had a store in orbit around Mars and we could order stuff and get it. I was amazed at that. And all those pictures I took in Iraq are really pictures in Mars, and they have camels on Mars.
And camel spiders, right? Yeah. My brother did a tour in Afghanistan and Iraq and Kuwait, and is still a private military contractor in Kuwait. So he too is very offended when he hears stories like that because,
Well, I did a thing on my blog about that, telling exactly all of these things, how we were, how they trained us, and unfortunately the brainwashing is leaking away because I can remember now being on Mars. And all the stuff I bought at Walmart. Walmart would ship the stuff to us really, really quick and really, really cheap. So we could shop online. Something we couldn't do in Vietnam, by the way.
Let me ask you briefly, because I know I'm personally running out of time. Otherwise, I'd keep going. I told you, unfortunately, I have an obligation. For everybody, the reason why I have to go is I'm being nice to help an older lady who doesn't drive anymore to get her home, who lives nearby. So that's why. But real quick, with the MJ-12 documents, what's your take on them? Do they confirm anything that happened at Roswell? Because Bob Wood did a pretty good job at analyzing them, about the typeface, about the ink and stuff like that. But
they couldn't analyze the ink because they never had the original doc. Well,
I was going to say, because it's just a photocopy, and it wasn't even a photocopy; it was a picture, wasn't it? A roll that came.
Well, the problem with the MJ-12 document, the original documents, all are the state of ufology in 1985, and the plains of San Augustine is not mentioned on the documents. Stan Friedman once challenged me, show me a document where it proves there was nothing on the plains of San Augustine. So I sent him a copy of the MJ-12 documents. I don't think he got the joke because it's not mentioned, but it's got this nonsensical crash at Del Rio. That comes from a guy named Robert Willingham, who claimed to be retired military officer. The only evidence I could find was that he had served in the Army for 13 months, from December of 1945 to January of 1947, which made him technically a veteran of World War II, even though the shooting war was over by the time he got in. Claimed that he had seen this crash. He was flying F-94s, which didn't exist at the time he claimed the crash took place. They were seen by the DEW line, which didn't exist when the crash took place. Presented documents that were clear forgeries. I got information from various outlets saying, no, this isn't correct. This isn't our document. They were clearly forged. And so the MJ-12 document, the main one, the Eisenhower briefing, had that stuff about Del Rio on it, and it turned out to be a complete and total hoax. And so I have no faith in any of the MJ-12 documents whatsoever.
This is why you're one of my favorite ufologists, is because you don't jump the gun and assume something is true just because it mentions UFOs in it. You actually take the time to research it. And that's one of the reasons I've always respected you. Even before I started doing this 9 years ago, I've been reading everybody's book for going back to the literally early 80s. So I'm very well versed on not just Roswell, but UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call them in general. Now, before we go, I do want to give you a chance to plug in your websites, and I'm going to ask you to stand by for a minute afterwards so I could thank you as we get off. But if you had a final statement to say about Roswell or anything we talked about today, what would you tell everyone?
Well, I think the evidence, to me, suggests I lean toward the extraterrestrial explanation for what's going on based on the evidence that I've seen and the people I've interviewed and the documentation I've uncovered in the years. So I lean toward the extraterrestrial because it's the one explanation that covers everything. We do not have what you would consider the smoking gun, but I think we can make an outstanding circumstantial case for it. I've got an awful lot of stuff up on my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com that deals with a lot of things we talked about tonight and goes into depth in a lot of that stuff. For the people who are really interested in Roswell, I think you need to take a look at Roswell in the 21st century because it's got like 1,000 footnotes in it. And so it shows where the information came from and shows the best state of the case as it exists today. I think it gives you a really good idea of what it is. And I think UFOs and the deep state explains why we haven't seen anything change since 1947, why we're still having these kind of discussions in today's environment. And we can see with the latest, the UAP report being similar to what was done 74 years ago. They're doing the same thing over and over again. And we're saying, yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, pushing it further back,
Yeah,
releasing a high school report, or less than high school. This is more like an elementary school report, a book report.
I was going to give them credit for high school.
Yeah.
Because they spelled the words right and it looked really nice.
Well, they got the aid of Google and everything else that adds in. Real quick, I want to tell people thank you for those of you for the super chat. We have Rockstar and welcome to the show. I appreciate you both. Make sure everybody here, check tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm not going to say who, because I have a tendency to jinx myself. If I tell you who the day before or week before, then something happens. I don't want you to get upset. So if things go to plan, you'll find out tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific. Also, be sure to subscribe, like, and share. And do check out my website. And tomorrow you'll be able to see the old and the new site. So you can tell me which one you want to keep to upload all the archives, since we need a safe forum. Since every interview I've done with Jerome Corsi, Roger Stone, or anybody related to Donald Trump sadly has been removed or demonetized because they do not like Republicans anymore, which is really sad. And with that being said, I want to give the Colonel a time to talk about where people can buy your books and read your blog.
Well, as I say, the books are all available at Amazon, of course. Type in my name and or the title of the book, and it'll get to you. Get there. I've done a series of books called Vietnam Ground Zero under the name Eric Helm, which are doing very well, by the way. But they were published first in the 1980s. They're being republished by a British firm. And I do a blog there, www.vietnamgroundzero.blogspot.com, so you can read about my experiences in Vietnam. And if you go to my other blog, there's a copy of one of the Vietnam Ground Zero books there, and it links to that, or it tells you how to get to the blog that way. The books, as I say, I did Encounter in the Desert, which deals with the Lonnie Zamora case. I think there's information there that had not been published before. I did the Best of Project Blue book, and you can see it kind of sitting over my shoulder, which is some of the better cases out of Project Blue book that didn't get an awful lot of the publicity that it should have, and kind of leads us to the extraterrestrial explanation. But go to Amazon, go to my blog, and I think you can get to what you need to get to.
And I'll make sure I put all the links in the description, so everybody who catches this after the fact will have a chance to literally click on the links below. With that being said, the Colonel and I are departing the public view for the moment, and we'll catch you both on the flip side.